Today we're going to be covering the IOI and the LOI. So two terms which I hear and when I speak with folks a lot about these two words and what they are, and more importantly, how can we frame it in a discussion of what is the IOI, what is the LOI, and how does it matter for your deal? You'll see at the bottom of the screen throughout the presentation, I have the word SIM, IOI, LOI, exclusivity, and then closing. So if you think about the life cycle of a transaction, I want you to keep in mind like where we are in the deal and where we need to be going. So like if you think about a small business acquisition, the closing is the transaction closing. So you actually completed a purchase. The sim is the marketing material. So that's really the beginning of your journey. So when we're talking about things, just make sure you know where we are throughout the process. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat, and I will try to get to them, as much as I can. Um, so when we think about, what is an IOI? What is an LOI? Like, what are some of the differences? Um, so an IOI is an indication of interest. An indication of interest, it's a starting bid to gauge an interest and valuation range without going deep into due diligence. Um, Typically, an indication of interest is non-binding in nature, and it rarely contains strict legal obligations. Um, the indication of interest, or IOI, uh, is typically high level, and it sets the valuation range, preliminary structure, and basic timeline. I always say an indication of interest gets you to the table, um, and a letter of intent commits you to a lane. Um, for those of you who filled out the polling question, where are you in your business search process? I appreciate it. This helps me better tailor, you know, the content and the folks, as we kind of work through this. So I really appreciate that. Um, so when we're on the flip side, when we're thinking about the letter of intent, so the letter of intent, also known as the LOI, it's a formal offer and a roadmap for the final negotiation. So typically, um, the letter of intent, once submitted and signed, you begin exclusivity and you kick off. It's generally non-binding in nature, but overall, it sets the stage for key deal terms such as the purchase price, what are the terms of the engagement going to look like, etc. Um, the letter of intent, I always say it commits you to a lane. So where are you going to go with the transaction? If you are someone who is self-funded searching and you are in the LOI phase, you likely have a very clear understanding of the differences between these two. But this is something that I kind of hear about frequently, so it's good to define each of them. Again, the IOI is likely before, any LOI, and it's a starting bid and it gets you to the table. Likely will gauge interest and it'll assess you as a buyer to the seller team. So what is the point of this? You want to know what to look at, you want to know when to look at it, and you want to use what you find to close faster and negotiate stronger. If you are someone who is looking to buy a business for the first time, you it's important to know like why are you doing these things? Why are you looking at SIMs, submitting IOIs, LOIs, and going into exclusivity? It's really to, close a business acquisition, and do things the right way. So it's really setting the stage for like, what's the point of all this? I find it's helpful to just, again, like I said when I started the presentation, you want to know what to look at, when you should be doing certain things, like when you should be submitting an IOI, an LOI, etc., and then what you should be doing during exclusivity. Things like due diligence, speaking with attorneys, doing operational due diligence, speaking with lenders, etc. So how does the process work, or how does the process flow? You'll see it kind of starts with um, a seller or the seller's rep will send over a SIM or the marketing materials of the business to qualified buyers. So if you likely have received some of these, especially if you are actively searching for a small business. Um, Based on the SIM or the marketing materials, you are going to submit, if requested, this indication of interest or this initial indication of interest, which is going to contain things at a high level, such as who you are. Um, each broker or seller rep may have a different IOI, and based on that, often this document is used to narrow the field, so narrowing the pool of buyers. Um, the seller often will select the top bidders or the people that he or she and the seller's team thinks are the most qualified buyers to move into, the next phase. So if the sellers elect to do an IOI as part of their process. It's not always the case, I will say. Sometimes they just want you to submit an LOI. The reason why they're doing it is they are trying to narrow the field of potential buyers. Um, from there, they are um, likely going to select a few of the IOIs to advance to a more formal stage. So after they select a few. If you move past this phase, you very well may be granted, initial due diligence or the ability to speak with the owners, ask more questions about the business, and ultimately get the opportunity to submit an LOI, letter of intent, which is a formal offer uh, for the business, which contains things like structure, deal terms, and other key findings and other key stipulations which you are going to use when you're in exclusivity. Um, the sixth step is really, assuming your LOI is signed, you move into what is known as the exclusivity or the LOI window, which is when things like full due diligence can be executed. Um, And from there, the clock starts ticking as you move towards business closing. So feel free to take a screenshot of this and save it on your desktop. I think if you do have a business that is requiring an IOI and LOI exclusivity and then closing, it's important to, save this for your records. If you want to get a copy of my Business Buyers Toolkit, feel free to scan here. This is the 2026 version of the toolkit. It contains things such as your due diligence checklist, the process, um, the latest 2026 versions of all of the documents over at OAG. Feel free to scan that copy, and you should receive it automatically via email. When we ran the polling question, it looked like about half the group was actively searching. There might have been one person under letter of intent, and then a few that are just starting out your search. If you have any questions about sourcing, where to turn, feel free to reach out to me after or throw questions in the chat, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. Um, To be respectful of everyone's lunch hour, we're going to keep it moving. If you want me to go back or want the toolkit, feel free to reach out and I can flip back up. So let's break down some of the key differences of the IOI and the LOI. So the key differences is at the IOI stage. So let's remember the IOI comes before the LOI and we don't have exclusivity. So it's very initial. Uh, I say the key differences is you're you're trying to stress test the deal to price it, but you're not verifying everything. So what do I mean by that? When you're in the IOI stage, you have very limited information, likely. Since you don't have exclusivity, you may not be able to access most of the personal and private data documents of the company, things like customer lists, access into their company systems and software. So you really need to just stress test the deal in order to answer a few questions. One, does this deal check my buy box? Like, is it a type of business that I want to submit a letter of intent for? Um, is it something that uh, is producing enough profit or EBITDA or SDE that is in line with my buy box or my ideal acquisition target? Does it fit my larger strategy if I'm part of, if I'm trying to do a roll up or if I want to buy a single business, does this directionally make sense? At the LOI stage, it's very much a confirmatory stage. So assuming the LOI is signed, um, you move into the exclusivity window, which is very confirmatory, and you're verifying the assumptions that drove the purchase price that you offered in the LOI. Um, Once you reach the LOI phase and you enter exclusivity and you start doing things like hiring attorneys, speaking with bankers, hiring CPAs, walking away, walking away from the deal at this point will likely cost you. So what do I mean when it costs you? Likely you're investing not only time but money into the process at this stage. When you sign an LOI, both buyer and seller create a binding document. And while you aren't committing to purchasing the business, you are committing to deploy capital and hire a team in order to verify and confirm the business that you submitted this for. So it's important, the key difference is the IOI stage is directionally, do I want to move this process directionally into the LOI phase? At the LOI phase, you're confirming a lot of the assumptions that drove the purchase price. So what is a common dilemma that I see a lot? So if you are new to this space, a common dilemma for the self-funded search or the independent sponsor community is before the LOI, you don't want to be over diligencing, but you also don't want to be under diligencing. So you're in a common dilemma of this weird sweet spot of, what is too much or what is too little before, I actually enter exclusivity, before I submit this LOI. So if you're over diligencing before, if you're asking for too many questions, if you want too much information before you submit one, it might signal that you're, some hesitation. A seller, you may begin to erode seller trust and it kills momentum. Uh, if you put yourself in the shoes of the seller, if you own a small business and a prospective buyer who you've just met for the first time begins to ask you very tactical questions, personal in nature, and you may lose trust in them early on. Specifically, if you aren't going through the process of submitting a formal offer, you likely will lose significant seller trust because they may find that you're not a serious buyer before you do submit an LOI. On the flip side, if you're in the before LOI stage and you've submitted an IOI, if you don't do any due diligence, and you just submit something blindly with very limited information, you may be locking yourself into terms that you can't get a bank loan for. You may lock yourself into terms that position you into a place of weakness and cause you to renegotiate once you are in exclusivity or near the closing time. Let me give you a couple examples. So if you're submitting LOIs with limited financial information, or if you're submitting LOIs that are overpriced, if you win the LOI and the seller chooses to go with you, that's wonderful. The flip side is you may be positioned in a position of weakness and forced to renegotiate your offer and lower your price because, for example, you can't get a bank loan, or the bank loan is too high to support the debt service coverage ratio if you're using an SBA loan. So uh, the common dilemma and what I recommend is when you are pre-LOI, you want to make sure you definitely ask the right questions and learn as much of the business as you can to submit a fair and reasonable deal. Uh, if you try to submit an offer that's too high or with terms that you actually want to renegotiate, very often all that's going to cause is the deal to break during exclusivity, and you're going to be out time, money, and back to the drawing board because you're going to have to look for more businesses. So when you're in this dilemma of how much should I ask the seller about, I would speak to some people in your network and focus on the big ticket items that can get to what is a fair purchase price for this business? What are terms that are fair and reasonable? And does this structure work for me? And more importantly, does the structure work for the seller? I think that's my 2 points of advice. So what you learn before the LOI shapes everything that follows. What do I mean by that? When you are in this IOI phase and before you submit the LOI, it sets the stage for a successful business purchase. I always say I can best guess if a business is going to close in the first few days of due diligence or exclusivity because you get a sense for, have the business been structured? Is the LOI a reflection of both parties' agreement on what is important to them? So are they on board with the terms? Do they both agree to working capital? Do they both agree that a 60-day window makes sense? Do they want something longer, etc.? The more open you are at the LOI stage, the better. So what are some things that can shape, a good LOI? It's going to have things like um, a purchase price. It's going to be a validated earnings to give you a number you can defend. Is it going to include things like working capital? Does the seller and buyer understand what that actually means? The definition of working capital. What does that look like at the closing time? Um, is the LOI going to include earnouts, or is it going to include a structure with a combination of cash at closing, um, a seller carry or a seller note? If it's not using SBA, it's going to include some sort of earnout structure. An earnout structure ties a portion of the total purchase price to certain benchmarks like revenue, net income, or EBITDA, SDE metrics in the future, so after closing. Are there going to be protections in the LOI? So are there going to be things like if the deal breaks or the seller gets cold feet, does something happen Is the LOI going to have stipulations such as it's going to automatically renew after 60 days if both buyer and seller are working together to get to closing? Things like that. So how do you manage sellers' expectations? So picture this. You are a buyer who is excited about an opportunity and you submitted an IOI. You have submitted an LOI and your LOI was accepted. So you're now in this exclusivity window. You're in due diligence. You're likely working with your deal team. You want to do a couple things. I always say that slow movement equals cold feet. This is on the buyer or the seller side. So the best way is to manage sellers' expectations. I always say set the stage at the beginning of your exclusivity for a formal kickoff call. The kickoff call establishes what is life going to look like during your 60 or 90-day due diligence period. Um, you want to keep your requests focused. So when you start out asking for data, etc., every request you ask needs to be with reason. Broad requests signal you don't know what you're doing. If you are uncomfortable with how to articulate what sort of data requests you'll need, um, this is why most folks will engage a deal team rather than trying to DIY their own business acquisition. Leveraging a deal team with specific M&A experience is very helpful because we know what to ask. And more importantly, we know why we should ask for certain documents and how to explain it to sellers who may be going through this for the first time. Um, you want to frame your line of questioning as standard practice, and you want to explain why, you're asking for certain things. Communicating your timeline, we touched on, explaining what each week looks like during due diligence or each, number of days during your exclusivity window. What are you looking to accomplish? It sets the stage for a cleaner exclusivity period. And momentum is leverage. Uh, Confident buyers give sellers fewer reasons to re-engage others. If you keep the ball moving forward, you are giving certainty to closing, which is very comfortable for sellers. If you keep momentum, you as a buyer create leverage. You may need leverage for a variety of reasons. One, if you are needing additional time, if the SBA or bank underwriting is taking longer than expected, you need to use that leverage to extend your exclusivity window. So if you originally negotiated for 60 days, if it doesn't look like your bank loan is going to be ready, you may need to push it out another 60 days. That's that can cause significant challenges from the seller's viewpoint. One, they begin to get some cold feet on if you're actually able to secure a bank loan. Um, so building momentum gives sellers fewer reasons to start thinking about, is this buyer really a good fit for me? Am I confident in their ability to close? These are all things you're going to need to instill confidence in early in the process. Unfortunately, I've seen many deals die because of bank challenges. If there are certain banks who pull out at the last minute, you need to extend your exclusivity window. So don't give sellers a reason to re-engage with others and basically terminate your agreement. Um, Momentum is leverage. So how do you set up post-LOI due diligence? So, a lot of it starts with setting the data room, aligning on timeline, etc. If you want to have a business under exclusivity and work with a QV team, they can better articulate this. So what does the deal timeline look like? So this kind of just recaps a lot of the days, from 0 to 90. So if you submitted an IOI, you can consider that the first day. Your pre-LOI diligence, believe it or not, can take anywhere from 1 week to 3 weeks. So you're doing conversations with the seller. You may be looking at some information, but you know, buying a business is a marathon, not a sprint. So typically, sometimes it can take over a month before you actually do submit and verbally sign or execute a formal LOI that's signed. Um, so for purposes of this example, let's say effectively the LOI is signed. This is when the bulk of the work begins. So this is really your exclusivity window where you conduct full due diligence. So you're going to do things like a QOV, operational, legal due diligence. And the end goal is to move to closing. So I said day 90. This could be day 120. It could be a day 180 from the date you submitted the IOI. If you have people in network, or searchers who have successfully purchased a business, I would ask them, what does the first initial point of contact look like, on what date? And then when did you actually close the business? Because it could be significantly longer than what you anticipate. I've had a few folks we've done QOVs for who they met the seller and began having conversations a year ago. They may have just submitted an LOI and did due diligence in about 90 days, but the timeline between, this initial point of contact and LOI can be very lengthy. So I'd encourage you to not get frustrated if the process feels lengthy, and feel free to save this on your desktop. So if you want to join me next week, in a few weeks, I'm going to have the independent sponsor report. So we put together the 2025 M&A transaction data, metrics on valuations, uh, multiples, how many deals were done, et cetera. We leveraged internally all the deals we worked on last year. And then we're going to talk about what does the outlook for 26 look like? We are in early March of 26, so the year is off to a fast start already. So what does the 2026 outlook look like for deals in the lower middle market? And why should you care? So feel free to scan the QR code and you should be able to join automatically. So some of the takeaways, you want to know what to look at. So we kind of talked about what is the IOI, what is the LOI, what is exclusivity, and then what does closing look like? The IOI, indication of interest, it's gets you to the table. It begins to showcase that you're a serious prospective buyer, and it gives you the opportunity to submit an LOI or a letter of intent. The letter of intent is that formal offer that's non-binding, but it does formally offer, and if accepted, it grants you exclusivity, which is a commitment from the seller's team to grant you a certain number of days to complete due diligence in order to get you to the finish line. And you use what you find during the IOI phase, the LOI phase, and in due diligence to close faster and negotiate stronger. Business, private business acquisitions and sales is very much a negotiation. There is no one clear answer on how the best way to buy a business or sell a business is. A lot of times it's human in nature and it's much more than just numbers. So by conducting the process the right way, connecting with these owners, if you're a buyer and the sellers one-on-one and learning about them, is how these business acquisitions and sales are completed. Uh, if you're a buyer, arming yourself with a proper deal team only gives you leverage. So we touched upon leverage and momentum. With more people in your corner representing you, the buyer, you give yourself leverage from the seller's team. On the flip side, the seller's team has typically several folks in their corner. They're going to have the business broker or representative who is representing them. I always say, if you are a prospective business buyer, you need to understand that the broker's job is to sell the business and they work for the seller. While they would love to get a deal closed because that's likely when they get paid, their best interests are in the seller's shoes. So any folks that they bring, any of the seller's team and people they introduce to you, you need to look at them with scrutiny because they work for the seller. The seller's team is also going to have an attorney, likely, who is going to help them negotiate the best terms for them. So the takeaway is when you are doing this, if you're a self-funded searcher or an independent sponsor, you need to surround yourself with a similar deal team that will represent you and your interests.